On air and streaming on the ABC Listen app.
ABC Radio Brisbane and Queensland.
You may be spending a little bit more time with your spouse over the summer holidays, and if you get into an argument during that time, what's the healthiest way to handle it? Michelle Jansen is a couples counsellor at Brisbane Couples Counselling. Good morning, Michelle.
Good morning, Ashwin. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Now, do we see a rise in fights over the summer season?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's exactly what you just said. We're spending so much more time together. It's that weird time of year where we don't know what day it is. So, of course, we're going to be in each other's environment a lot more and probably annoying each other a lot more. So there's definitely a rise in it for sure. So that's completely normal.
Okay, so the fights happen. What's the best thing to do afterwards?
So the work that I do is of the work of John and Julie Gottman, which a lot of people will be familiar with, and they actually have a process called aftermath of the fight. So they talk you through how to process a regrettable incident when it's happened completely and fully so you can figure out what went wrong. So the first thing I want to normalise is it's not so much what you're fighting about, but how, right? So even healthy couples fight. That's okay. So many people think, oh, if we were, better off, we wouldn't be fighting. But it's more so how you're communicating about it. So the best thing to do, first of all, is to just check in with yourself and think, whatever the fight was, am I ready to actually process the regrettable incident? Do I feel ready? Do I feel calm? And most of all, am I ready to hear my partner's perspective? Because that's probably the hardest thing to do. I hear so many people saying, yeah, I get that, but, and then it just becomes this tennis match of criticism and defensiveness. So you have to be really ready to hear your partner out too.
Okay, so how do we get ourselves really ready? Are there some thought processes we need to go through first?
Yeah, for sure. I would say pay attention to your body, right? So just be thinking about, okay, how am I feeling? Are my thoughts racing? Am I really clear? People, often... if they're not ready to process something, like they feel overwhelmed in their bodies, like their heart's racing or they're really sweaty or they can't think, right? So being calm in your body is probably the best first step I would recognise as being most important. But then also being able to tune into, before you process the content, like what happened, who was right, who was wrong. Because first of all, we're trying to aim for each of you were right. There's a subjective experience here. Tune into what were the feelings and just name the feelings. So I was feeling disappointed. I was feeling angry, because it's really hard to argue with the feeling, right? So that helps us to slow down in and of itself, because we're just tuning into the other person's experience.
Are some people not comfortable, though, talking about their own feelings like that? And does that take some work for them?
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. It's really hard, I think. Sometimes when I'm working with couples, at first it feels almost clunky and a bit awkward to try and talk about, well, what was I actually feeling? What was it about? What was I needing in that moment? Sometimes people can't quite articulate it without going into blame. So without saying, you're doing this, or you always, or you never, or getting defensive. So it can be really hard to slow it down. So quite often what I will work with couples is just being able to articulate. It doesn't matter if it's, if you don't have to be fancy and really articulate about it, but just kind of going, I felt sad, I felt bad, I felt angry. So if you can get to that, it just makes things so much easier to tune into. Okay,
it's interesting talking about feelings, because there's the universal ones, aren't there? Like happy, sad, angry, mad. But then some people have the ability to speak in such nuance about their feelings, perhaps the subtle variations in all of those. So, yeah, what's your advice about putting some of those feelings into words?
Well, I would say, just as I've said, just, aim for the basics first. Don't try and overcomplicate it. If it's just, I was upset, perfect, beautiful. That's a great starting point. But the idea is that you're talking about the experience, trying to describe it as neutrally as possible. So, when you started to raise your voice, I felt upset, I felt worried, I felt scared. I needed you to speak calmly to me. It's really contrasting, going with a gentle startup as opposed to a harsh startup, as John and Julie Gottman talk about. And then if you're wanting to be more nuanced, I work with my couples on, we have just a tool, like a feelings wheel, right? And it really goes into specifics, so you can be more articulate and specific about it. But again, that's just a skill that comes over time. So if all you can manage is I feel upset, great. That's perfect.
Okay, so we start with feelings, and then what? What's the process of taking it from there to actually solve some of these disputes or get past the argument?
Yeah, so you start to share your realities with each other, right? So this is where I would say slow way down and allow your partner to speak, try and tune into their experience. So you go one at a time. Is there any part of the experience that your partner is describing that makes sense to you, even if you don't agree? And that's the tricky part, right? Just try to tune into, well, it makes sense that you would have been a bit scared there, and it makes sense that you were feeling angry. And spend probably the longest time within that, just trying to articulate what each of your experiences were. And then see if there's anything in there that may be, triggered from the past, maybe something from your own personal history, maybe something from the relationship. And then you're basically trying to walk through it. This is where we now get into preventative planning for the future. Is there any part of what happened as you slow down and walk through it where you think, oh, gosh, I could have said that differently, or I apologize for how I said this? And then you walk through, okay, what's one thing that I could have done differently during that argument to make it go a little more smoothly? And then you ask your partner the same kind of question. This is the thing that I would have liked you to do to have made this to go more smoothly. And then ultimately, what do we need to be able to do or say to one another to move past this so we can put this behind us genuinely?
You are hearing now from Michelle Jansen, who is a couples counsellor at Brisbane Couples Counselling. Okay, so you've had this conversation, you've spoken about your experiences, and you've tried to find common ground or set a plan for the future. Are there certain terms, certain phrases that you should be avoiding in this conversation?
Definitely. I mean, it will depend on each couple, in terms of maybe how they fight and that sort of thing. But broadly speaking, I would say, it's what we would call, criticism, defensiveness, contempt, or shutting down and stonewalling. These are the 4 behaviours that John and Julie Gottman call the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which are aptly named, we're really strongly named, because they're the 4 most destructive behaviours that have been proven by research with how we communicate. So criticism, describing a problem, kind of making it a personality flaw about your partner, So instead of saying, this is what I was feeling, you blame the problem on your partner. Or defensiveness, it's that counterattack. It's that, yeah, but what about when you? So we try and work with their antidotes, with talking about how we're feeling, accepting responsibility. And then, of course, with things like contempt, that's kind of like criticism from a place of superiority. So we're trying to avoid the put-downs, the sarcasm, the eye rolls, the mocking, which can be very easy to do when we're feeling attacked. But again, we just try and step into thinking about how we're speaking, but then also really paying attention to our bodies. So with something like stonewalling, quite often that's a stress response, right? So we're starting to shut down, not give any verbal or non-verbal cues that we're listening. So being aware of asking if we need a break, to just process for a moment, take a few breaths. So what we're aiming for with all of this is being really careful with conflict, being a bit more gentle with each other. We don't have to rush through this. It is okay to pause, come back to something when we're in a calmer space, even as you're processing the fight. You have to be ready to do that, yeah.
Contempt is a very dangerous emotion, isn't it, of an attitude towards someone. Can you talk about that feeling of contempt, how to avoid expressing it and notice, and if you do notice it, because that can be a real relationship killer, can't it, contempt?
Yeah, absolutely. It's probably the most poisonous of those 4 because I think if you've ever been on the receiving end of contempt, it's that put down, whether it's, feeling put down for intellect or morally, but it feels icky to be on the receiving end of it. It just feels really immovable too. So if you're feeling put down or somebody's, rolling their eyes at you or making fun of you with jokes that don't feel quite funny. You know, like you can tell that there's a bit of an edge to them. I would say two things. As soon as you start to notice it, you know, if you start to become aware of this in yourself, you know, trying to make a repair attempt by going, oh, gosh, I think I'm doing that thing, you know, of contempt, or let me try that again, or apologizing, whatever it is that's happening. So trying to catch yourself out on that is really helpful. But then more broadly, working with its antidote, you know, around being able to express what you're feeling, what you're needing, and what it's about. Because it can do so much damage, and it's really hard then, because then you've got to repair from the contempt as well. Yeah.
Even though we're talking about reducing the impact of fights, are they in some ways beneficial to a relationship, and how can we use them to improve things?
Absolutely. Sometimes I will say to couples, actually quite often I'll say to couples, and they may look at me like I'm crazy at first, but when you can fight really well or argue really well, it actually is an opportunity to become closer and more intimate with that person. Because when you think about it, underneath every complaint is some sort of longing or some sort of need, right, that's not being met. So when